It has occurred to me that it's been a while since I had one of my fireside chats or one of my lunchbox soapboxes. So today I'm going to do kind of a merger of the two. I'm not outside today at the fire pit. I'm in my kitchen. I'm getting ready to sit down and have a glass of whiskey and watch a baseball game. But this reminded me of an actual fireside chat I had wanted to have to follow up another video I made about Jackie Robinson, the untold story. And in that video, I probably mentioned a guy by the name of Monte Irvin. Monte Irvin is who I like to refer to as the quote-unquote real Jackie Robinson. Now, Major League Baseball is well underway, and they actually just did their celebratory week or day, I can't remember if it's a day or a week, honoring Robinson, where all the players in the league wear his numbers. And so I wanted to make this video actually that week, but I didn't get around to it. So hopefully you still watch this and still enjoy this. Even if you're not a baseball fan, this is some interesting American history. So right here I have a little bobblehead. This is a Monte Irvin. That's a fun little thing that I own. And I also have a baseball over here. This is signed by 30 different Negro League baseball players. A couple Hall of Famers in there. Many of these guys were regulars in the league, won championships, all-stars, etc. And like I said, a couple of these are even in the Hall of Fame, which is going to be relevant to our conversation about Monte Irvin. And in fact, Monte Irvin is one of the people who signed this ball. So hopefully you watched my video on Jackie Robinson. If you haven't, go back and check that out as well, because some of that information is going to be relevant. But the interesting thing about Monte Irvin is his story is not unlike Robinson's in many ways, although the vast majority of people, the common man, may not even be familiar with Irvin. Now, if you're an aficionado of baseball or a fan of the Giants in the 50s, you certainly know who he is. But certainly he doesn't have the gravitas or whatever lionization as Jackie Robinson, which is unfortunate because he's really the guy we probably should be celebrating, and here's why. So Monte Irvin grows up in the South. I think he was from Alabama. I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But he showed great aptitude in sports, and he ended up getting a college scholarship to play baseball. He might have been there to play other sports as well, but baseball was the sport that he is now celebrated for. So he goes there. I think he does a year of college baseball and eventually gets offered a contract to play in Negro League Baseball with a team by the name of the Newark Eagles. Now, the Newark Eagles were an up-and-coming team out of the New Jersey area with a lot of young talent, okay? Irvin signs with them and goes on to have a really, really good start to his career. He wins batting titles, he wins Most Valuable Player, he wins, I think, a couple World Series, and he is pretty much in everyone's mind the guy, right? He's the up-and-coming talent, he's the future face of the league, and arguably the best young talent in the game of Negro League Baseball, okay? And then what happens is what happens to a lot of the young men of this era, which is the war breaks out. And then Irvin, like Robinson, ends up going to fight in the war. He's over there for a few years before he comes back. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, okay? In the wake of World War II, as all soldiers are coming back to the United States, there starts to be more and more pressure around Major League Baseball reintegrating the league, okay? And I say reintegrating because it is important to notice that the segregation of Major League Baseball was something that only applied specifically to that league, Major League Baseball, and had taken place in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and had been maintained for really about, at this point, 40 years, okay? Now, it started as a gentleman's agreement between owners, where the owners basically made this ruling that they were just going to keep the league segregated for any number of reasons, racism being the most obvious, but there were also pragmatic elements about trying to travel with teams that were integrated and things like this in areas that were following Jim Crow policies where they couldn't get hotels and dining and all this kind of stuff. But as I pointed out in my previous video, there were a lot of people, by the time you get to this point in time, the vast majority of people really were ready to reintegrate and allow for a lot of this young black talent to come into the league. But what happened is in 1919/1920, in the wake of the White Sox scandal of the gambling of the World Series, they decided to put a commissioner in place of baseball by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And no one really knows how he's going to sort of run the league and what his policies are going to be, and that's including around the issue of race. But much to some people's surprise and some people's delight, Landis was a staunch segregationist. And so rather than overrule the owner's gentleman agreement about race, he continues to enforce it. Now, again, this is not an official policy. It's not an actual rule in the book. It's just something that's sort of agreed upon under the table. Now, what a lot of people may not know about this is that baseball, as a result of this, is actually not ahead of the game. So if a lot of people think of Jackie Robinson as being this pivotal figure who sort of changed the scope of things, which he kind of did, but really that's the result of the fact that baseball was really, really far behind on the race issue. Because as it turns out, the other sports that were most popular in that era were boxing and track and field, okay? Our like modern NFL football, NBA basketball either didn't exist at all or were in infantile stages that looked nothing like what we would think of them now, okay? College sports were very, very popular. College football was very popular, which is how Robinson got famous. But the big pro sports were, first of all, boxing, globally was huge. And then because of the starting of the Olympic Games at the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was this huge popularity around track and field, okay? What's important to know about those sports is they never segregated. They maintained integration from the start. You have Jack Johnson as the heavyweight champion in 1910, okay? Some 35 years before Robinson ever reintegrates baseball. Then, of course, you have Joe Louis, another, 20 years later in the 30s, still precedes Robinson. You have other great fighters at like the welterweight, middleweight level, obviously Sugar Ray Robinson being the best example of that. Henry Armstrong, great fighter. But you also have Jesse Owens, who goes over and runs in the Olympics and makes a name for himself. And it's unquestionable that by the time you're in the 1930s, the three biggest names in sports are Joe Louis, who's a black man, okay? Sugar Ray Robinson, a black man, and Jesse Owens, a black man. So this idea that Robinson somehow changed the scope of sports is silly and not correct. You could argue that maybe he changed the face of team sports because boxing is an individual sport. Track and field is kind of a team sport, kind of an individual sport. But the reality is Major League Baseball was way behind on the race issue, okay? And again, it was largely because of Landis. By the time you get to the end of World War II, America's got a problem. Well, I mean, Major League Baseball has a problem because what's happened is you send all these young men over to fight in a war that's really a race war, right? This is when the Nazis are taking over Europe and they're implementing this segregationist policy towards Jews, okay? And when America sends its soldiers over, it doesn't discriminate. It sends both white and black soldiers over to fight the war. So now you have white and black soldiers who are coming back from a war they fought together over race, and now they can't play on the same baseball team together. The whole thing just looked bad, and that's because it was bad. But again, as long as Landis was in place, nothing was happening, okay? Now, what I pointed out in my previous video is that the reason why Branch Rickey actually decides to integrate is not because he's being a revolutionary or doing anything that's different than anything that anyone else wanted to do. He was being an opportunist, and what happened is he found out that Landis passed away. Well, really everyone found out, okay? Landis had just signed, I think, another 10-year extension to his contract. He wasn't expected to die, although he was older. So who knows what would have happened if Landis had continued to live for another 5 or 10 years. But because he passed, Rickey's like, here's our opportunity, okay? Let's snag up a lot of the best black talent. Now, what you need to know about Branch Rickey is also important to put both Monte Irvin and Jackie Robinson in context, okay? Branch Rickey became famous in the world of professional baseball, particularly Major League Baseball, by taking advantage of a very egregious contract law that only existed in Major League Baseball, okay? And the idea was also something that was drummed up by ownership. The owners of Major League Baseball teams decided that they would create a policy, whereas if a player, an individual player, signed a contract with a specific team, they were basically indentured servants or entitled to that team for their entire career, okay? And the reason they did that is it kept salaries low. There was no bidding war, right? If you're a great player, you couldn't go play for the Yankees or the Red Sox. If you already signed with the Cardinals, you were forever tied to the Cardinals. And that way, the salaries in Major League Baseball were extremely low. The only time a player could leave would be if they were either released by the team because they no longer wanted them, or the team utilized them in a trade for a player that they thought was better for themselves. But all this was designed to serve the ownership, not the players, obviously. Well, Rickey, being the smart opportunist that he was, got an idea. And it's like, well, why don't we just sign everyone we can find? any person who shows any ability, let's just sign him to the Cardinals. Again, this is when Branch Rickey started his career when he was in St. Louis, by the way, not up in New York with the Dodgers. And of course, the idea was, well, how are we going to do that? What are we going to do with all these players? And that's when Rickey ingeniously came up with the idea of the farm system. He's like, well, we have all these towns all across America. Let's put in small stadiums, and you can have your local club team, and we'll just funnel this talent into these little club teams around the areas, and then the guys who show aptitude will bump them up to the big leagues. And then what we have is this just sort of pool of talent that we can always pull from. And this becomes minor league baseball. Ingenious. Of course, Rickey starts the standard. He goes on to create a phenomenal St. Louis Cardinals team, the Gaslight Gang, and so on and so forth. In fact, he's the guy who discovers Stan Musial and gives him a contract, just by way of example. Well, of course, every other club in Major League Baseball decides to follow suit. Okay. Now, what a lot of people don't know about Branch Rickey is that once he finds out that Kennesaw Mountain Landis is dead and is no longer going to be around to implement this segregation law, he's thinking, well, I got to get all the best black talent out there. And he wants to do that by, first and foremost, trying to sign as many black players as possible so that he can abide by this contractual policy that's specific to Major League Baseball, meaning they're then sort of entitled to, or I should say, permanently linked to the Dodger organization. But he also gets the idea of, well, where are we going to get the best talent? All the young best black talents in the Negro Leagues. So he gets the idea, I should start my own farm system for Negro League players, or essentially a black minor league baseball league, so that I can start bringing all the best black talent and then bring them to the Dodgers and essentially do the exact same thing he did in St. Louis with the white talent. Okay, a lot of people don't know this about Branch Rickey. Okay, thankfully it totally fails and doesn't work out. But this all comes back to a series of problems and a series of things that relate both to Monte Irvin and Jackie Robinson. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Okay, as I mentioned in my Jackie Robinson story or video, the real Jackie Robinson, the untold story, in order for Rickey to decide who he's going to pick to be the first guy to reintegrate baseball, he has several caveats. Okay, he wants Robinson because Robinson's a household name in the white community. Robinson grew up in Pasadena in a white neighborhood where he went to a white elementary, middle, and high school, where he played on integrated sports teams his entire life. He played on an integrated sports team at UCLA in football, basketball, and track and field. He didn't play baseball because he wasn't good enough to play baseball, interestingly. And he essentially is familiar with white culture, and he's palatable to white audiences because he's a household name in white households as well, because of his background in track and field as well as college football. In fact, many people were projecting that Robinson would be the next Jesse Owens, but because of the war, he didn't get to go off and run track in the Olympics as hoped. So that's why he picks Robinson on the surface. But there's also a few other things. Besides that, Rickey needs Robinson to follow a couple gentlemen's agreements of their own. Okay. Firstly, Rickey tells Robinson that for his first 2 years in the league, he has to essentially take a passive approach to any type of racism that he experiences in the league. Okay. Robinson actually agrees to do that. Okay. So some people applaud Robinson for doing that, but others maybe not so much because they think it was, a kind of a, I don't know what the word is. Well, it wasn't a progressive approach to the issue. But there's some other issues as well. Rickey runs into a problem. Robinson, like all players coming out of the Negro League, are signed to Negro League baseball teams, which means they are under contractual agreements with their team. So in the case of Jackie Robinson, it would have been the Kansas City Monarchs, right? And in the case of Monte Irvin, it's the Newark Eagles. Well, again, Branch Rickey's always been able to take advantage of this clause in Major League Baseball. So what he does, and unfortunately Robinson colludes with him to do, is to essentially dismiss the Negro League Baseball organization as an unorganized, shoddy business, and therefore their contracts are not really legitimate. It's all just sort of hearsay. They don't have official charter of rules that have to be followed. And what this allows Rickey to do is to take Robinson from the Monarchs without compensating them for their player. And what it does is it helps him to attempt to discredit the Negro League as a quality baseball organization so that he can in turn around and promote his own new Negro League, minor league that he's trying to create. Okay, well, the minor league fails, but Robinson follows suit and he says, yeah, the Negro Leagues is really disorganized, blah, 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 blah. And he basically, he caters to Ricky's, requests, which is, again, exactly why he chose Jackie Robinson to be his guy. Well, what about Mr. Monte Irvin? Okay, well, here's the story of Monte Irvin. So both Robinson and Irvin come back from the war. Robinson is approached in secrecy by Ricky. He doesn't really let anyone know what's going on until he's already signed with the Dodgers. He agrees to all Ricky's agreements and he leaves. Another caveat that's interesting to know, once all the veterans of the Negro League find out that Ricky is choosing Robinson over the players that they had picked, so they had already started hearing the rumors that there was going to be reintegration in Major League Baseball after the war because of all the chatter around race, okay? So they had already picked their guys, and the leader of that list was Monte Irvin. This is the guy that all the Negro League baseball teams wanted to represent them, and they thought was the best option. But there were other guys. There was Larry Doby. There was Ray Campanella. These are guys that do eventually go in to play in Major League Baseball after Robinson. Everyone's shocked that he picked Robinson because he was certainly not the best talent. But then when they think about it, they realize what Ricky's doing. The problem is the Negro Leagues and the veterans in the league are concerned that Robinson's not good enough to transition into Major League Baseball. And to be fair, at the time, he probably wasn't. So prior to Robinson dismissing the league, following Ricky and not honoring his contractual agreements, etc., all the top talent, guys like Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, actually spend time working with Robinson to improve his game. They're the ones who tell him he can't be a shortstop. Jackie Robinson thought he was a shortstop. Cool Papa Bell tells the story, hey, no, bro, like you're not good defensively. You can't play shortstop. So he ends up being put to first base. They teach him how to hit holes in his swing. He's like, you can't hit this, you can't hit that, blah, 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 blah. They show him that. They teach him how to run bases properly, stuff like this to really tighten up his game. They recognized that Robinson was a phenomenal talent. Okay, he was a world-class athlete, which is precisely why they pursued him to come into the Negro Leagues. But he wasn't a baseball player at the time. Ricky knew that as well, which is if you go back and listen to things Ricky says, well, just be strong on the base pass. His whole thing with Robinson is just get on base and try to steal, because at that time, a lot of the players weren't stealing bases, and that was very popular in the Negro Leagues. And Robinson, because of his speed and athleticism, Ricky knew he would be able to be good at that. Of course, as we know, Robinson does go on to be a phenomenal baseball player and have a world-class, Hall of Fame career. But what about Monte Irvin? Okay, well, Monte Irvin comes back from the war just like Robinson, and guess what? Branch Rickey also signs Monte Irvin just like Robinson, but he doesn't want to bring Irvin in first for all the reasons I just said. But it's not just that. Monte Irvin doesn't want to go into baseball right away, and here's why. Monte Irvin says to Branch Rickey, "Thank you, Mr. Rickey. I'm so thankful that an honor that you would consider me to transition into Major League Baseball and to sign me to a contract with the Dodgers. There's just a couple problems. So firstly, I've been over at the war, fighting in the war. I haven't really been playing competitive baseball for a while. And before I left for the war, I actually had a wrist injury. And I saw my numbers kind of slipping. I would like some time to go back and play in the Negro Leagues to get up to speed, to make sure that my quality of play is at the level it was before I left." Again, Robinson is no way ready to play. They have to actually prepare him because he's not good enough. Irving is their best player in the league, arguably, and he says he wants to make sure he gets his game back up. So he says, "I'm going to need more time." He says, "Secondly, there's an issue of my contract. I've been working for this team, the Newark Eagles, for years. They've taken care of me. They've been good owners. They've always provided for me and my family. Before I come to your team, you would have to buy my contract out from the Newark Eagles." And Branch Rickey is like, "Wait, what?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, you gotta honor the contract of the people who have me." And Ricky's like, "No, I'm not doing it." So he releases Monte Irvin. Monte Irvin goes back to the Newark Eagles, plays 2 more years with the Eagles, gets back up to speed, and then eventually gets signed by the New York Giants. Okay, Irvin becomes one of the key members of that New York Giants team as the first all-black outfield. Okay, but at this point in time, because of the early years of his career, the war, and then returning and going back and playing for the Negro Leagues for a couple of years. He's now sort of a veteran, the tail half end of his career. And he becomes more of a mentor. And the person he becomes primarily a mentor for is Willie Mays. And Willie Mays shares the outfield with Monte Irvin, and they win World Series, and they both go on to have Hall of Fame careers. Now, if that's not interesting enough, what's even more interesting, perhaps, is what happens after these men retire from baseball. People probably know that when Jackie Robinson retires, he sort of becomes this icon of, cultural reform and, whatever, race relations and things like this, just as sort of a figurehead. But what a lot of people don't know is that Robinson had a lot of very problematic political ties. Firstly, in the 60s, he campaigns with Richard Nixon. In fact, he campaigns against John F. Kennedy. And during the Vietnam War, Robinson actually pens a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. requesting King to cease and desist on his lack of support for the Vietnam War. That's right, Robinson, unsurprising, was a conservative and tended to support the conservative position politically and socially. And it did, at the time, sort of, how shall I say this, cloud his perception amongst most Black Americans. But a lot of that's kind of been sort of forgotten and sort of erased over in hindsight. But that was a very unpopular stance at the time, especially in the 60s, okay? Meanwhile, Monte Irvin retires from baseball, and he's so well liked and so beloved by his teammates and everyone that the commissioner of baseball actually offers him a job to come work for Major League Baseball, where he works as one of the corporate people in the corporate offices. He's really instrumental in helping to integrate the sport and work better with young Black players and getting them in the league. But he does all kinds of things over the years, and he ends up being the guy who essentially works to get Major League Baseball to recognize the Negro Leagues. And in fact is the guy at the forefront of honoring all the great Negro League baseball players by getting them placed into the Hall of Fame. Okay, so now there's over 30 members of the Negro Leagues in the Hall of Fame. All of that is because of Monte Irvin. So Monte Irvin is really the guy people should be celebrating, in my opinion. To me, he's the real Jackie Robinson. He was the real talent initially, and again, not taking away from Robinson's ability to actually perform well. If you look at their stats, they're comparable. He was also college educated. He also went off to the war and was a war hero. But the difference was he wanted to make sure that he honored his league and was a proper representation of his league and his race. He wanted to make sure that before he came into the league, he was at a position of quality of play where he would not be an embarrassment, but that he could stand out and shine. And more importantly, he wasn't willing to adhere to Branch Rickey's caveats and sort of dismiss the league and not honor the contractual agreements that he had signed. And as a result of that, he doesn't even get placed into Major League Baseball till a few years later, after many other players have already integrated, after he's kind of now on the second half of his career. And while he was still recognized as being a great player, he never got the recognition of a Jackie Robinson. So that's a little fun history for you. And that's why I love Monte Irvin. And that's why I think he is the real Jackie Robinson that probably very few people know about. Have a good one.